This Economics Out There is about this op-ed that appeared in the Globe and Mail in January of 2019. It was one of many media stories in reaction to the dramatic change in how students will pay for post-secondary education, and this was put in by the Ford government. I want to talk about it both from the point of view of the economics of it and also from the point of view of writing an op-ed, because this is an op-ed and there's some things I'd like to call your attention to that good op-eds do. So let's just start with the content. Well, we're starting with the fact that the government announced a 10% cut in tuition fees for domestic students. But at the same time, the government cut most forms of financial aid, so that for lower income families, you may get a 10% gain in less tuition paid, but the amount you lose from the lost subsidies is going to be much greater. So this is actually going to increase fees for low-income families, or at best hold them pretty much constant. And this is the unintended consequence, is the tuition cut, because it's universal, it subsidizes or makes more affordable tuition for even those students and their families who could easily afford to pay. This is very much like, I hope you are remembering, one of the unintended consequences of rent controls, and they end up subsidizing tenants who don't need subsidies. And the reason that's important is because the system, the post-secondary system, still has to be paid for, and so the money that is paying for it, that's no longer coming from tuition, is coming from general tax revenues. And so that in effect it's shifting the burden of taxes a little bit more towards people at the bottom of the income distribution as opposed to the top. So this author is arguing that that's wrong, and instead we should be focusing on financial aid. And most economists, including me, would agree with that kind of an argument. She talks about here, the tuition cut is the populist cherry on a regressive policy sundae. Well, this is a little bit overwritten from my point of view, but I would like to talk about the language here from an economics point of view. So this is very much a populist motivated policy. It's not based on economics, it's based on appealing to the voter base of the Ford government. But what is regressive policy sundae? Well, other than the Sunday metaphor, regressive is a term that's in chapter 12 in your textbooks, chapter 13. And you can classify tax policies as regressive, progressive, or proportional. Most income taxes in Canada are progressive, which means the higher your income, the greater the proportion of your income or the fraction of your income you pay in taxes. The opposite is regressive policies, where the lower your income, the greater the proportion you pay in taxes. An example of a regressive tax policy is the GST or the HST. Everybody pays the same 13% on whatever it is they buy, but purchases make up a much bigger proportion of income of people at the bottom end of the distribution than at the top, because people at the top are saving a lot of money, investing a lot of money, and you don't pay HST or GST on that. So that's an example of a regressive policy. And this downward shift, this subsidy of the people who can afford it from a tuition point of view, and no improvement for the people who are at the bottom and least able to afford it, is a move towards a regressive policy. The next point right here is another classic example of unintended consequences. When tuition is frozen for domestic students and universities have to make up the difference for revenues, well, what are they going to do? They're going to take in more international students where tuition is not regulated, and the tuition rates are much, much higher. So one of the unintended consequences of this policy is there'll be fewer spots available for domestic students, which is certainly not a populist intention. It's an unintended consequence. The other argument here towards the end, this is a little more abstract, is the importance of higher education for protecting jobs for the future. There's a great threat from automation, artificial intelligence, that more menial jobs will be replaced by machines. And so if you want to preserve jobs, those have to be jobs that require higher education. And this policy is making higher education less accessible, perhaps a tiny bit cheaper, but less accessible because of the substitution of international students for domestic students. So those are the economic arguments against the new tuition policy. And the last thing that I've highlighted is just for the purposes of op-ed writing. One of the things that you want to do in a good op-ed is you want to have a clear and convincing call to action at the end of your op-ed. That's one of the items on the rubric that you get graded for. And this is a pretty good example of that. Instead of engaging in an ill-advised ideological battle against universities and colleges, the provincial government should develop a long-term plan to grow the provincial higher education system, make it fair and more accessible to all Ontarians, or we will all pay the price for their short-sightedness. So that sentence really sums up all of the key ideas in the op-ed. The ideological nature of the battle, the populist nature of the battle, the idea that it is not as fair and accessible as it was before, and that without higher education, that's the short-sightedness, there won't be the ability to protect jobs in the long term. So a really good example of both an op-ed and of the unintended consequences that happen from ill thought out government policies.